morning. For you, those who don't know me, my name is Kathy Kane. Before I share with you what I prepared, I just had a few comments. There were 14 people in our group that went to La Plante. 4 or 5 of us were newbies, 4 were making their 3rd trip, and the remainder were making their 2nd trip. Simply Smiles has made a difference in La Plante. The people who had been there the 3rd time noted the difference in the children, how well they got along, their behavior, and for the first time they talked of what they wanted to be when they grew up. Some of them talked about wanting to go to college, and that wasn't so before Simply Smiles came to La Plante. Having said that, so many times over the past few weeks, I sat down at the computer and began writing what I was going to say. And just as many times, I erased it and started all over again. Every time I went for a walk, everything I wanted to talk about would run through my mind. There was so much I wanted to say. How it came that I went on the trip, how I felt from the first moment of May 2nd, and every moment in between until I returned on May 9th. The tightrope that Simply Smiles must walk because one misstep could jeopardize their existence. The joy and sadness that is La Plante. The high incidence of substance abuse, alcoholism, and suicide. The interactions with the kids during camp and the emotions I felt every time we rode the big red school bus. The issues and complexities that make up the Cheyenne River Reservation, its people, and their long and complicated history cannot be fully understood in 1 week, and certainly cannot be summed up in 5 to 10 minutes. To even begin to understand would take many trips to La Plante, many conversations with its people, and an immersion into the history of the American Indian. So after much thought, I decided I would break it down into 3 parts in the hope that it would paint a picture of my trip to La Plante. Part 1. I would like to talk about 2 of the individuals I met and share a little bit of their stories. I will begin with Barbara. The first time I met Barbara was on Sunday afternoon when we got a tour of the community. Simply Smiles had renovated her home a few years earlier, and she was immensely proud to show it off. That evening, she came to the community meal, and I had the pleasure to sit and have a conversation with her. It really wasn't a conversation. She talked for well over an hour, and I mostly listened. I would guess Barbara to be in her early 60s. She is married with 4 grown children. She is deeply spiritual, and prayer is an integral part of her life. She told me about her son, who is currently in prison. His lawyers told him if he pled guilty, he would receive a lesser sentence, but he was adamant that he would not plead guilty to something he didn't do. Currently, he has served 5 years of his 10-year sentence. She and her husband travel to Minnesota once a month to see him, and she states she wants to live long enough to see him released. At this point, a small smile comes across her face, and she explains that Brian Nurnberger, founder of Simply Smiles, first came to La Plante around the same time her son began his sentence. Her son's name is Brian also, and this is no coincidence to her. With every fiber of her being, she believes God has sent Brian Nurnberger to La Plante. She proudly states she has 14 grandchildren, and Brian is her 15th. This is the first year that Brian will not spend the entire summer in La Plante. In order for the organization to grow, he must spend more time in the office in Connecticut. Although Barbara understands this philosophically, Brian's absence leaves her with a broken heart, and throughout the week she wells up with tears whenever she mentions his name. Her love for him is so intense that his absence is almost unbearable for her. Her story continues, and in the time I sit with her, she barely pauses as she goes from one topic to the next. They rarely see the same doctor twice, and she is keenly aware that this is detrimental to the health care of her own family and the community as a whole. She knows there is nothing in La Plante not only to entice professionals, but also to make them stay. A few years ago, her 13-year-old grandson suffered a serious fall and was complaining of knee pain. She took him to the clinic, and the doctor told her he was making it up in order to get attention from her. He gave them Advil and sent them home. 3 months later, when her grandson was still complaining of pain, she took him back to the clinic. Unfortunately, they saw the same doctor. He took one look at her and said, "Oh, it's you again." Tears well up in her eyes, and she says, "We are not cattle. They treat us like cattle." This is a mantra she has repeated numerous times throughout her story. One only has to sit with Barbara for a short time to realize she is intelligent, empathetic, insightful, and truly brokenhearted, but her concerns are not selfish. She is keenly aware of the infighting, rumor-mongering, and substance abuse among the adults of the community. It breaks her heart that they cannot see the effect this has on the children. She tells me she prays constantly for unity, and I tell her I will also say her prayer every Sunday when I am in church. This also brings tears to her eyes. The second person I will introduce you to is Steve. Steve is the owner of the first house that Simply Smiles completed. Throughout the week, he expresses his desire for a group to come see his home, which we do on Thursday afternoon. It is decided the newbies will go because the others have already seen the home. Also, it is the end of the week, and there is still a great deal of work to be done. You can see the house from the community center, so we walk the short distance through the field. About halfway, Zach, the staff person who is with us, stops us and states he would like to give us some background. In 2012, Steve found his 12-year-old son Tanner after he had hung himself in his bedroom. Steve and the other 2 children cannot bear to return to the house, and they break up and live in different homes in town. Another gentleman had been selected to receive the new home, but he gave it up, stating Steve and his family needed it more. Zach explains that the Simply Smile staff clean out Tanner's room. They had all known him, and he says the task was haunting. Tanner was bullied, and Steve brings his concerns to many employees within the school system, guidance counselor, principal, superintendent, but his words fall on deaf ears. At that time, the school was run by the tribe, and the individuals in charge are related to the perpetrator. Zach also tells us that Steve, who is in his mid-40s, was a police officer. He no longer works and is on disability after a serious work-related injury that damaged his heart. In complete silence, we continue our walk to Steve's house. There are several pictures of Tanner in the home. He is a beautiful child with dark eyes and a smile that spreads across his entire face. Steve explains he doesn't use the term suicide and calls it bullycide instead. He travels and gives talks about bullycide to any group that invites him to speak. He talks almost nonstop the entire time we are there. His wealth of knowledge regarding the history of the American Indian is immense and mesmerizing. He talks of their spirituality and respect for Mother Earth. He can recite every battle, or massacre as he calls them, the year and location they occurred, the names of the chiefs and the generals, and the history of the boarding schools whose purpose was to civilize the Indian children. Abuse was not uncommon in the boarding schools. On the way back to the community center, we are all in awe of the depths of Steve's knowledge and level of detail. The next morning, I awoke early, and I went outside and sat on a bench on the edge of the center. It was the second time I cried since I had arrived in La Plante. Part 2. And for those of you who don't know, at some time during the week of the ASP mission trips, Dick Mullen would ask everyone what was their God moment. Wake-up time at the community center was 7 a.m. Those of us who got up prior to 7 would quietly get our coffee and go outside and sit under the pavilion. The mornings in La Plante are absolutely gorgeous. The prairies go on for as far as the eye can see, and with the lack of trees, the sound of the birds is amplified exponentially. As I sat with my coffee, facing the east, watching the sun begin its ascent on La Plante, God's presence was profound. I literally felt God in those moments. but I wasn't sure if it was because I was in a place where his Spirit was so desperately needed, or if we just miss it here amidst all the distractions and noise. There is profound peace and beauty in stillness, and it is difficult to find with our hurried, complicated lives. In some ways, there is much we can learn from LaPlante. That was my God moment, and it is dedicated to my dear friend, Mr. Mullen. Part 3. 2 days after I got home, someone asked me what was the one thing I took away from the trip. Having barely been home and still overwhelmed by the experience, I said I would have to sit with it for a while. Now, roughly 6 weeks later, I can say this. I learned that if you pay attention to the quiet moments, you can not only feel God's presence, but you can also learn a lot about yourself. I learned from Barbara that you can truly love another human being after having only known them for one day. I learned from Steve that people who have survived man's inhumanity to man have a story that deserves to be heard. I learned from Brian Nurnberger that there are truly remarkable people in the world who don't give up, don't take no for an answer, and give hope to those who have none. Would I go back? In a heartbeat. Thank you.
I've been to the plant 4 times now, in a little less than 2 years. And each year on the way from Rapid City Airport to the res, which is a 4 or 5 hour trip in the big red bus, we stop in Wall Drug. Some of you may have heard of Wall Drug or even been there. I can't really do it justice. But I have to honestly say, being there for the 4th time in less than 2 years, it wasn't, I wasn't looking forward to my time spent there. Yet, wandering around in the nooks and crannies, I found some things I hadn't seen before, a collection of historical photographs that were really, really interesting. And I thought, well, maybe I am meant to be here right now, and this is part of my journey. I also found a book. They have a bookstore. Wall Drug is just this collection of shops all strung together and touristy kinds of things, and it goes from kitschy to really high-quality stuff. There's a chapel. There's also a bookstore. And I found this book, Neither Wolf Nor Dog, and picked it up and found a little time to read it while I was there, a kind of another meant-to-be kind of experience. But this is written by a man, an academic, who had published books about Indian culture that were well received, and the granddaughter of an old Lakota Indian. On the res in Lakota, they call themselves Indians. I know in other places they prefer Native American, but the Lakota are fine with self-identifying as Indians. He was an old Indian, and he wanted somebody to tell his story. So they invited this guy to come meet with Dan, the old man, and learn about his story. And they had an extended conversation that you might have between good friends who really trusted each other, that aren't afraid to ask all the questions that they have and aren't afraid to answer honestly. And it really is a marvelous conversation that's been set down into this book. And there's a section where they talk about Christianity. And I'm only going to pick up on a few things. But it was how, when missionaries first introduced Jesus to the Indians, they did find things that resonated with them. So Dan says, Jesus was like an Indian. He didn't own anything. He slept outside on the earth. He moved around all the time. He shared everything he got. He even talked to the Great Spirit as his father. He was just like an Indian. And he goes on to talk about how a subset of Indians grew really faithful and gathered together in preparation for the second coming of Christ, which they believed that they could do better than the white man. They wouldn't kill Jesus the way the white man did. They would have feasts for him. They would welcome him. But this newfound faith, even though delivered by the missionaries, scared the white people and the authorities. And so they discouraged the meetings. They broke up gatherings that were focused on this. And it was troubling to him, and he said, listen, the only thing you ever gave us was Jesus. And when Jesus gave us hope, you took Jesus away too. And this is, he goes on and concludes, we believed too much. We loved Jesus too much. We made him our leader. You didn't want him to be our leader. When we went to see if he was coming back, you killed us. All the women, all the little children, so much hope. Dead. All dead. Well, the arc of my experience at La Plante so far is the first time I was there, the sense of hopelessness was pervasive and difficult to describe, and hard not to try to map yourself into that experience and say, well, what would I do if I was here? And why don't they try this? And why do they do that way? And it can't be understood unless you understand the hopelessness that has come over these people and what it's like to live without hope. Now, I'm pleased to say that there are signs of hope in La Plante, largely due to Simply Smiles. It's not like their world has been turned around. It's still very, very hard to live on the reservation. Conditions are awful, and Kathy talked about talking with Barbara, who's well aware of what all the challenges are and how some of them are made worse by the behavior of the Indians themselves. But we have to remember that when we visit, that we have privileges that people on the reservation don't. And these are unearned privileges. We didn't earn being born where we were. To be born in Connecticut or somewhere near here and not on a reservation and not on a slum in a third world country or not on the land overcome by violence or civil war. We didn't earn being born where we were. We didn't earn the color of our skin. Some of the unearned privileges we have come from living in a great country, an economic, social, political, cultural, and military giant. And it is a great country, but it's a great country in part because of undeserved suffering. Our predecessors took almost everything from the native people, providing them with little in return. The land we took unfairly is part of the foundation, perhaps even the cornerstone of our prosperity. We have to own this. Our unearned privilege comes with a debt, with a responsibility to try to do the right thing with our sisters and brothers who descended from these native people. We took everything from these people, their land, their freedom, their entire way of life, often their lives, and when the surviving few had nothing left but hope, we took that away too. People are resilient. It is hard to kill hope. It takes a long time. You might think it is easy to restore hope, but it is not easy when there have been so many broken promises over so long a period of time. It will take generations to set things right again. I doubt I will live long enough to see this. It would be nice if my children could live to see this. We can despair that our own efforts are too small. We will, if we are honest with ourselves, always know that we could do more and choose not to. But we care too much about being rich, and I'm not excluding myself from this. I've been to the res, and I'll go again. I have seen progress, and I have seen setbacks. I pray that I am doing the right things. I pray that my small efforts will contribute to a more loving, just, and peaceful world. I pray that I am planting seeds of hope, and that these